Clauses 1 and 2 stand part. Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This has been quite an extensive, well, not as extensive as some of us would have liked, Committee of the Whole, and that is because there are a number of issues that have been raised with this legislation. And so, given that there is concern on this side of the House that this bill both does some things that we think are detrimental to our electoral law, but also misses out a number of things that we think would make important improvements to our electoral law that the public desperately want Parliament to actually get on with doing. I think a very appropriate name for this legislation would be the Suppression of Democracy Bill, because it suppresses democracy in a number of different ways. First is the obvious, which is that by removing the legislative requirement that the voter identification card, the easy vote card is what most people would know it as, by removing that legislative requirement in combination with this new requirement that again came out of nowhere, that a person must verbally confirm their identity to the person in the polling booth. Those two things combined are a very, very dangerous situation for a lot of people who will find it more difficult to identify themselves when they get to the polling booth. Sir, it is known the world around that voter identification cards, like the Easy Vote card that we have in New Zealand, are a facilitator of higher voter turnout. And they know that in Canada. They know that in Canada, sir, where there is research that has been produced in recent days to counter their Conservative government's argument that the voter identification cards in Canada, that their use should also be suppressed, and that changes should be made over there as well to the way a voter identifies themselves when they present themselves at the polling booth. And actually over there, because frankly actually the legislation that the Canadian Conservative Party is proposing is considerably worse than what the National Party is proposing here in New Zealand. What I think National Party has done is they've seen what they're doing in Canada, and they've tried to do some catch-up with some of the changes that have been made as this legislation has been making its way through Parliament. There has been much more public outcry in Canada about what their Conservative government is doing, and in fact an extensive filibuster by opposition members in Canada, where they have a system that allows for much more extensive filibusters than what we can do here in New Zealand. Such is the concern about the detrimental impacts on democracy and voter turnout of the legislation that the Canadians are promoting. But I think what the National Party has done here in New Zealand is they've looked at that and they've thought, you know what, there's a few ideas that we can take out of that, and there's some ways that we can use the changes that are being made to electoral law here in New Zealand to suppress turnout and suppress democracy. Because we know, it's just a known fact, that all around the world, the progressive parties, the parties of the left, do better when there is a higher turnout, and the Conservative parties, they do better when there is a lower turnout, when more people feel they can't go to the polling booth, or they don't want to participate in the election, or when they show up at the polling booth, some reason is found that their vote doesn't count. And this is always done in the name of eliminating electoral fraud. And every time some party uses the excuse that by opening up the electoral process so that more people can participate, it potentially opens up opportunities for electoral fraud, the argument that is used against that is that electoral fraud is almost non-existent. And that is certainly the case here in New Zealand. There is no documented evidence of electoral fraud occurring at the polling booth. When somebody shows up with their voter identification card or without it, there is absolutely no example that any member of the government or any example that I've been able to find in researching this legislation of electoral fraud at the polling booth occurring in New Zealand. So what's the problem? What exactly is the problem that the government thinks it is solving, Mr Chairman,
Lees-Galloway.
that the government thinks it is solving by removing the legislative requirement for the easy vote card to exist and by requiring voters to identify themselves verbally? That may not seem like such a big deal, but we know that one of the most marginalised groups in New Zealand, one of the demographics that is most likely not to engage in our electoral processes, is new migrants. Usually people for whom English is a second language. And when those people are asked to identify themselves verbally, it is absolutely possible that the name they have and the way they pronounce their name may not be entirely obvious to the person checking their name against the roll, and that person may find it extremely difficult to find that person on the roll, and that may be used as a barrier to that person being able to vote. But just the act of actually having to engage verbally, rather than presenting your easy vote card that has been provided to you in order to facilitate you casting your vote, the act of having to do that may be off-putting, in fact probably will be off-putting for a lot of new migrants who struggle to engage in everyday activities in New Zealand because of language barriers they have. And I think particularly of the former refugee communities that I have in Palmerston North, and I know other members represent those kinds of communities right across the country. The older generations in particular, who have spent many, many years of their lives in refugee camps, have not had the opportunity for education, certainly haven't had the opportunity to learn English whilst they've been living in those refugee camps. Their knowledge of English is extremely limited, but I can tell you this, sir, they are desperate to vote. But they don't want any barriers put up in front of them. And I wonder why exactly it is that the National Party seems so hell-bent on putting barriers up in front of people. So I do see this as a voter turnout reduction bill. I do see it as a suppression of democracy bill. And I think, actually, frankly, what we've discovered, because this is going on around the world, this is just another Crosby-Textor special, where they've advised the parties of the right around the world of another way they can rig elections, rort the elections in their favour. But the biggest rort, of course, is the thing that's missing from this legislation, and that is the abolition of the coattailing provisions. 71% of New Zealanders want the coattailing provisions to go. There was no good reason for them to have been put into our electoral law in the first place. The member brings up Jim Anderton. You could put a small thermonuclear weapon under Wigram and you still wouldn't have got rid of Jim Anderton. There was no coattailing involved in that. The people of Wigram loved Jim Anderton and they kept returning him. That is the situation in Wigram, Maurice Williamson. So don't please try to compare John Banks to the situation down in Wigram with Jim Anderton. No, that is not a valid analogy to make at all. What is happening right now is the National Party is making deals with the likes of ACT. Peter Dunn didn't used to have to rely on a deal with the National Party, but now he does. And of course we don't know what's going to happen with Colin Craig. Maybe Murray is going to have to give up his seat to Colin Craig to make sure National gets themselves over the line. New Zealanders are sick of this. You gave them the review. Then you listened to what everybody had to say. You didn't like it, so you said, no, we're not going to continue on with that, even though the vast majority of New Zealanders wanted the change to happen, and the national government promised them that when the review happened, then changes would be made to MMP. That's what New Zealand expected. That's what New Zealand were promised, but because of their own self-interest, the National Party has failed to deliver on the promise they made before the last election. And, sir, I do hope that this Parliament gets the opportunity later this year to consider the bill in my name that would get rid of the coattailing provisions. I do hope that we get far enough through the members' orders in order to debate that before the election, because I want to hear why the National Party thinks it's the right thing to do to block the logical change that New Zealanders are asking for. We have a party vote threshold. If parties can get to that threshold, they can be represented with list MPs in the House. That's what New Zealanders want to see happen, and that's what's missing from this legislation. And the reason it's missing is because the National Party wants to rort the electoral system in their own interests, which is the same reason why they are trying to suppress voter turnout with the changes that were made to this law with no explanation whatsoever.
Chris Farfoy.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Simply put, the title of this bill should be changed to the Electoral